it's one thing to say this is the benchmark for the metric, but it's another to say that these have all been measured in exactly the same way. And so with average billable rate, think about all the different things that could affect that metric in terms of small idiosyncratic differences in measurement.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel Petitpas. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision.
Hey, what's up? It's Marcel here. And in today's episode, it's just going to be me again. And we're going to be talking about something that I end up finding myself talking about a lot to agency owners, which is this idea of benchmarking and benchmarking metrics and trying to compare ourselves to benchmarks. And I want to talk about this specifically in the context of, Q4, Q1, end of year thinking. Q4 and Q1 is a time when people tend to start focusing a lot on their performance. How did we perform? Are we performing well? And how should we plan to perform next year? What kind of targets and budgets and goals should we be setting for ourselves? And this is where it's very easy to fall into a couple of traps. And the main one that I want to talk about today is the trap of using benchmarks and information about how other firms are performing as a replacement for an actual understanding of our agency's model and how we're performing relative to that. In particular, the trap of looking at absolute benchmarks as a way to get feedback on how we're doing, rather than understanding the relationship between a metric and our profitability and performance as a firm. So I want to start by talking about benchmarking. In particular, benchmarking data that I don't really find useful. In fact, I think it can be detrimental, and it tends to be a big waste of time and money. Now, before I get into that, I want to start by saying that I think the pursuit of benchmarking data generally comes from the desire to answer questions that are legitimate questions, or questions that I think have a valid purpose or reasonable things to be wondering about. But what's missed on the people asking those questions is that this benchmarking data is not actually a good way to answer those questions, or could be giving them information that seems like it's accurate, but in fact, it's not very accurate at all. So let's go through one example of this, would be rate benchmarking. So this is a metric we get asked about all the time at Parakeeto. What is the rate that other agencies are charging out there? What is the average, and how do we compare to that? And so to just unpack that for a moment, there's a couple of different things that somebody might actually be asking when they ask that question. The first could be, how is our pricing compared to other agencies, right? So that's one question we'll talk about. The second is, are we pricing enough? Are we pricing enough to be profitable? So those are, reasonable questions to be asking. And the funny thing is, getting a rate benchmark or a set of rate benchmarking data is actually just not going to answer any of those questions well, right? So let's start with the first one. Are we charging more or less than other agencies? Well, if we're in a scenario where everybody is charging by the hour, that is maybe a little bit helpful to get an understanding of if you're charging more or less than other firms. But unfortunately, that's just not the case anymore. The reality is, in 2024 and beyond, very few firms are exclusively billing by the hour. In fact, I would say that many firms are exclusively billing using flat or value-based project and retainer fees. And some firms are still doing some time and materials billing, but it generally is not the lion's share of their work. And so in a lot of cases, rates are never being discussed with clients, and rates are not being exposed to clients. So that's issue number one, which is that if it's about client perception, rates are no longer really a helpful way to get an understanding of how we're going to be perceived by clients relative to other firms, because the rate isn't actually the central point of conversation with clients. Now, even if it were, there's this second issue, which is how much are we quoting for a given thing, right? So it's one thing to say, oh, our rate is the same as this other agency who will charge $150 per hour. But if you tell the client it's going to be 200 hours to get this thing done, and then your competitor is telling them it's going to take 300 hours to get the thing done, then you still end up with a different absolute price. And of course, that becomes more important when the absolute price is the thing that you're talking to the client about. And today, that is increasingly the case. So the reality is that even with rate benchmarking data, the question of are we charging more or less than our competitors is still not really going to be answered unless you can start to get your hands on SOWs or proposals from competitive agencies to get an understanding of how they're scoping and pricing similar work. The other thing that's really interesting about this, and that a lot of people don't consider, is that what somebody has on their rate card, whether that's external or internal, because there are still a lot of firms that arrive at a price by taking a number of hours that they estimate a project's going to take, adding contingencies, whatever, to that, and then multiplying that by an internal rate target to arrive at a price. I don't love that way of pricing. We could talk about that on another episode. I'll link some resources in the show notes on a better way to think about pricing. But let's say that even if you are arriving at a flat or project-based fee using that methodology, the internal rate is still not that important because in our experience, the rate that goes on the rate card, whether internal or external, is rarely the rate that the agency is actually realizing. So we have a whole entire episode on rates, which I'll also link in the show notes that goes into much more detail about this, but let's go through a simple example. Let's say that I have a project and I charge $50,000 for that project and I get that project done in 500 hours, right? So my rate on that project, my effective rate, or what we would call average billable rate on that project, is $100 per hour. So here's the funny thing. How did we arrive at that $50,000 price? Well, there's a whole bunch of different ways that we could have arrived there. We could have estimated 250 hours at $200 an hour. We could have estimated 1,000 hours at $50 an hour. We could have aimed for a 70% margin on $15,000 of delivery cost. We could have charged a 50% markup on $100,000 of pass-through expenses. We could have just had a value conversation with the client and arrived at a price of $50K. We could have had a dartboard with balloons on it and blindfolded ourselves and thrown darts at that dartboard and come up with a price of $50,000. At the end of the day, if the agency gross income that we get from that project is $50,000 and we spend 500 hours to get that done, the price and the unit economics of that project are identical in all of those scenarios. It doesn't matter how we arrived at the price. And so this further reinforces the idea that even getting an understanding of what someone's internal or external rate card looks like is not indicative of their pricing. And it's not indicative of their efficiency or the rate that they actually realize on this work, because especially in modern contexts where time and money are not intrinsically linked in the billing model, the effective rate is a function of what is charged, but also how much time it takes, and therefore how efficiently revenue is earned. This is critically important because that information is incredibly difficult to get for a number of reasons. Number one, very few firms are actually measuring this metric. This is surprising perhaps to you. If you're listening to this show, you have an interest in these things, but very few firms actually know their average billable rate as an organization, and much less on individual clients' projects or different service lines, both before and after they sell something. And so that makes it incredibly difficult to collect this information. But then the other thing that's true is among firms that are tracking this metric or some variation of it, there are a lot of idiosyncrasies that can create a wide spread on this. And this is a problem with a lot of the metrics we're going to talk about from a benchmarking perspective. Is it's one thing to say this is the benchmark for the metric, but it's another to say that these have all been measured in exactly the same way. And so with average billable rate, think about all the different things that could affect that metric in terms of small idiosyncratic differences in measurement. For example, number one, what is agency gross income? What is the baseline number? Is it all the revenue that's connected to that client relationship? Is it that revenue minus pass-through expenses? What is considered a pass-through expense? And then what time is being included in the baseline for the hours that we're dividing that revenue by? Is it just billable hours? Is it delivery hours? Those are not the same thing. Again, more information on that in the episode linked in the show notes on rates, but a billable hour is time billed to the client. A delivery hour is all the time spent on that work. Those are often different concepts. Are we including freelancer time or contractor time in that? Are we including all of the people on the team? Like what is and isn't included in that? Those definitions can vary from one firm to another, and they can have a material impact on that metric. So benchmarking that, which would be a much more useful metric to get us an understanding of how agencies are performing, would be helpful. But the other issue with that, of course, is that average billable rate is not a proxy for pricing. you could have a higher average billable rate than another firm and be charging less than that other firm for the same kind of work because it is also influenced by efficiency. Okay, so that's my rant on rate benchmarking. The TLDR on this is that if you can get your hands on rate benchmarking about what people have on their internal, external rate card, it's not really an indication of pricing, and it's certainly not an indication of the rate that they're actually realizing. And so it's not necessarily that helpful unless perhaps you're in an environment where you're still presenting rates to clients and you know that the competing agencies that you're working against are also presenting rate to clients. And I suppose if you're selling to large enterprise companies that have, RFPs and procurement processes, maybe you're selling to government, education, that might still be a thing for you, and that's fine. But for the majority of the firms that are listening to this, which are going to be boutique, digital, creative agencies, consultancies that are not selling into those markets and don't have to go through these rigorous RFP processes, then what your rate is compared to another agency's rate is just not going to be that significant of a factor in your ability to win business against other people. And it's also, again, not really going to be a clear proxy for how people are pricing or even how profitable they are. Now, that leads us to a couple of other benchmarks while we're on this subject that I don't really love. Revenue per FTE is another one where I think that, again, people use this to try to answer a number of questions. And I find that the way that it's benchmarked is not really helpful to answering any of those questions. So one is, are we charging, more or less than other firms? So it's, again, somewhat helpful for getting an understanding of that, but it's not really directly correlated. And the other question is, are we more or less profitable than other firms? I guess. And so the way that this is benchmarked is typically in absolute terms. So, people will throw around things like, 100K per FTE is bad. 175 is good. 250 plus is great. But the problem with that is that true? Right? How do we know that without also understanding what somebody's cost basis is? Like, for example, if I had a firm that was in San Francisco, my average salary was $180,000 and I had a revenue per FTE of $250,000 per employee, then is that good? Well, no, obviously not. It's not good. The ratio between my salary costs and my revenue per FTE is not very healthy, and I probably am struggling with cash flow. Whereas if I had $100,000 revenue per FTE, but the majority of my team was in a geography where my average salary was like $35,000, that would be actually quite good. The margin on that is quite good, better than the example that I used in San Francisco. So you can't really use absolute benchmarking for a metric like that to get a useful insight. There's also, of course, a lot of idiosyncrasies of that metric as well in terms of how specifically revenue is being defined, how FTEs are being defined. Are we actually just focusing on FTEs? Are we looking at FTE equivalents, right? So be wary of the revenue per FTE metric in terms of absolute benchmarks, and I would not place a lot of weight on that. Revenue is another one that can be very misleading, especially in the context of definition of revenue, right? What is your revenue versus what is somebody else's? I like to use AGI. It tends to be a more normalizing factor, but again, there's a lot of nuance in terms of what is considered pass through and what's not. So this is all to say that I think in the context of, especially coming up on the end of the year, you're trying to figure out if you're performing well, how you're doing. The tendency to want to look at what other agencies are doing is a tempting one, but I would argue that it is at best unhelpful and at worst misleading. And the more important thing to be focused on is how are we performing as a business relative to our model? And really there's two parts to this, which is our model as a business sound and capable of getting us to where we want to go? That's question number one that we want to answer, and we'll talk about that in this episode. And then question number two is how are we performing relative to that model? So this is where we get into relative benchmarks, which I think are much more useful because they speak to the relationship between metrics inside of the organization and the margins that those relationships create, which are really the more important thing to be focused on as a business. So the first step in all of this is to understand the model of the agency. This is important both for looking at historical performance and also important for looking forward. And it's the first step in our process at Parakeeto with every new client engagement, because unless we understand the model, then it's really, really hard to put any metric into perspective. because it'll be unclear if that is the expected result or not. And it'll be unclear if the problem is execution or the fact that the business is actually designed to have that outcome, especially in the case where the outcome is not good or is perceived as being not good.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
How do you build a model of your agency? Well, it really requires you to think through three essential sets of information. The first is your people and the structure of your team. This is by far the most important and most significant part of building out your model. And so the process here involves writing down for every single person on your team some simple information. So let's define a time period. Let's say we want to look at the next 12 months, or we want to look at the last 12 months. So for that time period, you want to basically capture who was working for you during that time period. When did they start? When did they end? If they weren't around for the entire time period, then you want to be able to identify what period were they around for. Then you want to list out for each individual how much were they paid, including all of the additional costs of employment that you would roll into that, like benefits and health insurance and 401k matching and all those things. Then you would want to look at what was their capacity during that time. So what was the total amount of hours that we're buying from them? For most full-time employees, that's 40 hours a week. You might have some part-time people in there that is less than that. Once we have an understanding of the capacity we're buying from them, the next question becomes, what was the intended distribution of that capacity across a few important areas? The first area is delivery. So how much of that person's 40 hours a week, for example, did we expect to be spent actually doing client work and earning revenue? So, for most producers, that's probably somewhere in the range of 28 to maybe on the high end, 36 hours a week, let's say 32 for most people. Then there's the question of how much time was spent doing delivery work that was not directly attributed to clients. So we call this delivery overhead. Project account managers, senior people on delivery teams tend to have a good distribution of time in this area. So this is a function of running the delivery team, but it's not directly working on clients. So we want to understand how much of a person's time is being spent there. For most producers, 100% of their capacity is going to fall into those two buckets. So for example, a designer, they're probably going to have, let's say, 32 hours that are expected to be spent per week actually earning client revenue. And then the other 8 hours are going to fall into delivery overhead functions. So filling their timesheets, professional development, being on status meetings, and all of their non-billable time is essentially still a function of delivery. It's all cost of running delivery. Then the other things you're going to want to pay attention to are sales and marketing and administrative time. Some people on the team are going to be split across all four of those categories. Some people will all fall into one, and that's all fine. But we want to allocate basically where this person's time should be going. And again, this is not where has it gone. That's important. It's not necessarily about where their time went. It's about where the model of the business intended for that time to go based on their role in an ideal realistic scenario. So the way you want to frame this is, what if we had unlimited client work to do? Ideally, where would people's time be spent? So it really speaks to the responsibility that these people have in the business, not a reaction to how much work you actually had at that time. So once you've done that, the last piece is time off, right? So how much time off do we expect these people to get across company offsites, sick time, holidays, paid time off of any kind? So once you've included time off, now we have an understanding of two important things. Number one, our capacity as an agency across the entire business, and including, and importantly, our maximum utilization rate. So essentially, when we look at the total capacity across each person, we add that up for the time period. That's going to give us our gross capacity. And then once we look at the time that is specifically allocated to delivery, and we subtract from that all the time off, that's going to give us utilization rate maximums for each individual, but then also for the whole organization. And what you'll probably find here is that this ceiling is probably lower than you expect it to be. For most firms, this falls somewhere in the 45 to 60% range. And generally, we want to see a firm land in the 50 to 60% range. But it's not uncommon for us to see firms land lower than that, especially if they were big and then they had to downsize. Often the mistake that they make is they cut a lot of individual contributors and then they become kind of top heavy, and there's a lot of senior people in the organization that don't actually do a lot of delivery work. They end up with these low utilization ceilings. So the first thing you want to pay attention to is, what is our capacity? This is going to help you understand, where does our payroll go in the organization? How much do we spend on delivery? How much do we spend on sales and marketing and administration? And then also, what is our capacity? What is our available delivery capacity? And what is our utilization as an organization? So that's the first big piece, is really getting a grip on your people. The second piece that you then want to focus on is budgets. So through this model of people, we have an understanding of how much payroll is going to go to overhead versus delivery, and that's including sales and marketing, administration. But then the next piece is when we look at the hard costs. So that's when typically we want to dust off our P&L and quickly get an understanding of, what are we spending on things like software, on things like legal, accounting, rent, utilities, all of those kinds of things, and what functions are those supporting? And typically there's 4 buckets that you could group these into. The first is delivery expenses or shared delivery expenses. So for example, you probably have a Figma subscription, you have an Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, maybe you have some ad management software, you have some AI tools, and these are all just tools that your delivery team brings to the job. They're not just for specific clients. They don't scale incrementally with clients. These are just things that you pay for because they help your team do their work. So those are often going to get grouped into delivery. Then you're going to have your overhead, software expenses, et cetera. So again, you want to group those into sales and marketing, administration, and facilities. Those are the 3 main buckets you want to group all of your other expenses into. Based on that information, you should be able to get a sense of, what are you expecting to spend across these different areas of your business. Now, the last piece is we want to start to think about our rates, in this case, our average billable rates as an organization. And so if you want to figure out what this looked like for the last year, you simply want to pull up your P&L and get an understanding of how much agency gross income you earned in the year. So you would do that by looking at your revenue and subtracting out any pass-through expenses. Pass-through expenses would be any money that you collected from the client but that didn't belong to you. So for example, if you collected $500,000 from a client throughout the year, but $400,000 of that was actually advertising budget for Facebook, and you paid that out to Facebook, then that client had an agency gross income of $100,000. So after you spent the money on the pass-through expenses, whatever was left over, which may have been a combination of markup, of agency fees, whatever, that is your agency gross income. So you want to isolate that figure for your P&L and then get an understanding of how many delivery hours got spent to earn that revenue. So this is, again, not billable hours, but how much time did your team spend doing delivery work? You divide the agency gross income by the delivery hours. That gets you an average billable rate. Once you have an understanding of that rate, then you can set a target for the period. So in the past, let's say that comes out to 140, but you really would like to get to 150. You would set 150 as your average billable rate. Looking forward, you would set it at whatever you want that target to be. Let's say you want to be at 155 because you plan on increasing your rates. So now that we have all of this information, we have an understanding of our people, we have an understanding of our budgets, we have an understanding of our target average billable rate, how efficiently we expect to earn our revenue. Now we can start to really understand our model. So number one, we want to figure out how much money could we earn as a business if these things were true. We maximize our utilization and we were able to achieve our target average billable rate. It's actually very simple math. We take the gross capacity of our team, we multiply that gross capacity by the utilization rate that we're targeting, and then we multiply the delivery hours that nets us by the average billable rate that we're expecting. So just to give you a simple example, if I had 100,000 hours of capacity, I expected a 50% utilization rate. That would mean 50,000 hours are going to get spent earning revenue. And I expect to earn an average of, let's call it $150 per hour. Then I can do $7.5 million with this agency. And again, this doesn't mean that you're pricing by the hour. This just means across all of the things that you sell, when you look at how much you get paid and how many hours get invested to get the thing done, that's the rate that you end up with on average, right? So that gives us our revenue. How much money can we earn with this team? And then we have all the other information we need to know in order to determine if that's going to be healthy. So we'll know how much we're going to spend on delivery because we know how much payroll is going there. We know how many expenses are going there. and then we'll understand the ratio. So what we're aiming for there is for less than 50% of that money to be spent on delivery. So that means we have a delivery margin of greater than 50%. So 50% or higher is good, right? So that's a relative benchmark, and that's a benchmark you can pay attention to. So delivery margin, you can think of that as gross margin, contribution margin as well. The benchmark there is you want to be at 50% or higher. If you're between 40 and 50, that's okay, but you're probably struggling with profitability. If you're below 40%, that's not great. You're probably not profitable or barely breaking even. If you're at 50 to 60, you're doing awesome. If you're 60% plus, you're doing fantastic. If you're at 70% plus, you're doing something very special. You probably have a deep specialization, very premium pricing. You have labor arbitrage going on, or maybe you're building some proprietary tech or processes that are really helping you drive great margins. So all the power to you if you're at 70% plus. I know some firms that are. It's great. So just know that that's possible. So that's benchmark number one. What is the relationship between what it costs you to deliver your work and earn your revenue and the AGI that you can bring in? Then the second thing you want to pay attention to is how much you're going to spend on overhead. So again, you now have an understanding of, because you've done your payroll allocations and because you've got your budgets for overhead, how much you plan to spend on overhead. And the goal there is to keep your overhead to below 30% of that agency gross income number. Usually between 20 and 30% is where we'd expect it to land. And these are loose benchmarks. I don't place a lot of emphasis on this, but generally you're going to see your sales and marketing and administration both end up at 8 to 14% respectively. This is across both payroll and hard expenses. And if you have facilities, those will usually land anywhere from 0 to 6%. And the important thing is not really those detailed benchmarks. You could be over or underspending on either of those. But the important thing is, of course, that you end up usually around 30% of your agency gross income, with the asterisk that the higher your delivery margin is, the more you can afford to spend on overhead and still have a really strong bottom line. And then lastly, we want to focus on your operating profit. And this is different than your EBITDA. I don't really think it's that smart to remove amortization, depreciation from your operating expenses, because in some cases, those are important factors in the operating costs of your business. For example, if you need to buy really specialized equipment, let's say you do video editing and you're spending a lot of money on computers and monitors, and the depreciation on those is a legitimate part of the delivery expenses of running your business, well, you want to understand that cost. So I focus more on operating margins, and generally you want to be able to achieve 20 to 30% operating margins or greater in your model if everything went perfect, right? So that's generally what we want to see in the model. Of course, if you achieve less than 20%, between 10 and 20, that's pretty average. Below 10% is not great. And if you can achieve over 30%, you're doing excellent. So I tend to focus much more on these relative benchmarks because those are much stronger indications of if things are healthy. And the first place to pay attention is our model setting us up to achieve those kinds of ratios? And then what we want to look at is how are we performing relative to those ratios? The same thing is then true for things like average billable rate, for utilization. It all starts with understanding the model and understanding that there's an infinite combination of utilization and average billable rate that can get us to healthy economics. So it's true that you could have a 30% utilization ceiling, but if you have really high average billable rates or a really low cost per hour on average, then you could still have great margins, right? So that's not necessarily a problem. And this is why I think it's important to look at all of this together in a model, because you might raise the alarm bells if you saw, oh shit, our utilization ceiling is only 30%, when the reality is it's not actually that important because the rest of your business model accounts for that. So that is how I want to encourage everyone to pay attention to this. And I know that this has been a lot. And if you're listening to this, you're probably feeling pretty overwhelmed. Maybe you're thinking, I need to double back and listen to this a dozen times. But I have a surprise, a treat for all of you. We have been working on some software, and we've started beta testing a really simple, low-cost tool that is designed to help you with your model and really actually give you the ability to create a model of your agency, which, as we talked about today, can be really, really useful for understanding if your agency is set up to accomplish what you want and give you a really solid foundation for comparing your actual performance against. And it's the first thing we do with every client that we work with. And I want to make it available to you at a very low cost. And so what I'm doing on this episode is, for those of you that have listened all the way through to the end, I have an Easter egg for you, which is that you can try it for free for 90 days by going to the link in the show notes or heading to parakeeto.com/model beta. Okay, so parakeeto.com/model beta. There'll be a form that you can fill out. Our team actually has to manually set up an account. That's how beta this is. There's no automatic account creation. It's very early days. And they'll send you an email with access to this software, and we'll send you tutorial videos on how to set it up and use it. And it will actually give you the ability to do everything that I just described during this episode. So plug in your entire team, instantly calculate all of the key metrics related to that team, including their capacity, their utilization ceiling, where your payroll is going, how much is going to each part of the business. It'll allow you to set budgets for overhead, and it will allow you to play with all of the variables like your average billable rate, your utilization, your budgets, and see the impact that that has on your business and whether or not that gets you to the profitability that you're expecting. And then it'll give you something that you can compare your performance to. So I want to encourage everyone that has made it this far in the episode to go take advantage of that. It's absolutely free. You'll get 90 days of access at no cost. If you want to keep using it afterwards, you'll have the option to do that for a nominal monthly fee. And hopefully that's helpful to just getting you, especially at this critical time of the year, a little bit more clarity on how your business is performing and how it's designed to perform, which is really a fundamental question. And I hope that, I know I rattled off a lot of benchmarks in this, but I hope that those were helpful. And I want you to know that there's a bunch of these benchmarks that are documented in our agency profit toolkit, which is available to you at no cost if you go to parakeeto.com/toolkit. And there'll also be a link to that in the show notes. So this has been me ranting a lot on this episode and firing a lot of information at you. But the message here for everyone is, at a time like this, when the focus starts to get onto performance, it's really dangerous to start looking at what other agencies are doing to try and validate whether or not we're performing well. And what I would encourage everyone to do is look inward first at their model and get an understanding of what their business is designed to do from a performance perspective. If you're going to start doing benchmarking in that exercise, I would pay attention to the relative benchmarks, right? So is your delivery margin healthy? Is your overhead healthy? Is your utilization falling within a reasonable range? Is your average billable rate at least 3 times higher than your average cost per hour, right? Those are helpful metrics because they speak to relationships between costs and income, which are much stronger indications of performance and allow for a lot more of the nuance. And once you understand your model, and if your model is healthy, then you have a much stronger baseline to compare your actual performance to and start to get an understanding of where the problem actually is and what you need to focus on and do about it. And importantly, you can start to differentiate between things that are execution problems, which would be, we were supposed to be able to do this much in revenue, let's say $1 million, and we only did 600,000. Well, that is a performance or an execution problem versus we were expecting to have a 30% net profit and we landed at 20, but in looking at our model, we've discovered that our business was only designed to do 20. So that's not a failure of execution. Your execution was perfect in that sense. It's that your plan was setting you up for failure, but you weren't aware of it. And this is a very common mistake. And it's why we always want to start with the model. So I hope that all of this was helpful. If you enjoy episodes like this, then send us a message, let us know so we can do more of them, and let us know what you want us to talk about, what questions you have, what you'd love to hear our perspective on here at Parakeeto, so we can include those in these internal episodes that we're going to be doing. Thank you again for listening. I hope that you have an amazing 2025, a great start to the year. With that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I'll see you on the next episode.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.